Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 5 as David has become king at Hebron over Judah and now at Jerusalem, reigning over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. But as one renowned Roman historian once said about becoming an empire and conquest, the conquest phase is one thing, and then there's what he called the decorating phase, which is to say to provide in a city like Rome all the visible aspects of what make your king the king and gain respect, because after all, decorating is cheaper than military, which is to say, if people resist, it's expensive to get soldiers out there and ammunition of whatever form that might be, and to defeat them. It's much easier to get them to comply by taking in a narrative that gets them to believe that the status quo is legitimate, and especially if it's authorized by your god or gods. And that's exactly what we're going to see in this unit of 2 Samuel 5 to 10, as you can see on the right side of the screen, as David has become king and will enter in a whole series of acts, at least according to the way the story is written, that indicate that he is absolutely king and is the only one to be king and has Yahweh's approval. But as we'll see, hidden within it are some clues that it's ambiguous, that although David is certainly Yahweh's choice, there's an element in which everyone should be going, but wait just a doggone minute. And that will come up in chapter 7, as we'll see around the question of the temple. Because as we'll see there, and you can see a little bit of it here, these parallels between the question of the monarchy in 1 Samuel and the question of the temple in 2 Samuel. And let's just briefly go over some of these before we go over the acts of royal consolidation, so we can see a little bit about how our unit here fits into the larger picture of what the writer or writers are doing in the two books of Samuel together. So the thing that certainly makes the connection most obvious is number 2 here, the question of the location of the ark and its power. In 1 Samuel 6, the ark moved around on its own and ended up decapitating the statue of the Philistine god Dagon. And in 2 Samuel 6, as we'll see, the ark continues to move around such that David is afraid of it until he's assured that it's somewhat tame. It's a symbolism of Yahweh's freedom to do whatever Yahweh wants, and we'll see the parallels there. But that leads back to this bigger picture, which is that in both situations, there's the presence and threat of the Philistines that generates insecurity and fear. First, in 1 Samuel, to have a king so we can be quote-unquote like the other nations. And as we'll see here, to consolidate David's reign so that they can be clear that David is the one that they wanted all along to protect them from the Philistines or whoever else might threaten them militarily. But we'll also see how that back in 1 Samuel, not just with the question of the king back in 1 Samuel 8, of they've rejected me, not you, as Yahweh says to Samuel, but the whole question of the relationship between human royal power and Yahweh's own power, which is to say, once they have a king, what is the relationship between Saul, in that case, his power, personal power, and Yahweh's? And that was an issue there, and it's going to be an issue here again around David's personal power and Yahweh's in 2 Samuel 7. There's a desire for security in both cases. The monarchy was certainly to secure them against the Philistines, and the temple as providing the kind of solid, stable presence there that Saul never had in his wandering around and simply being back in his hometown, which had none of the insignia of being a royal city and had not been a royal city. So David is going to try to establish here all the elements of a royal city that would put him on the same level as all the kings of the region, including Hiram of Tyre, as we'll see in chapter 6, who finances the building of David's royal palace. That in both situations, Yahweh allows the very act that he opposes. In 1 Samuel 8:22, he says, let them have the king, but tell them what it'll be like. And here we'll see, although Yahweh does not need a temple, he'll allow David's son Solomon to build a temple. And that can lead some scholars to argue about sources, a pro-monarchical and anti-monarchical, and maybe that's the case, as we'll look at in just a minute as the overview, but maybe not. Maybe a single author or whoever the writers were recognized the ambiguity of having a king, and were not just pure propagandists, but established, as nobody else had done in the ancient world, the ambiguity of the God they believe in giving a human royal power and what that means for the people. And then finally, in these parallels, the king's successor will be the one to establish the desired goal. That David, not Saul, will be the monarchy that unites Israel and Judah, as we see on the left side of the screen right now. And Solomon, not David, will build the temple. So we have to look at, before we look at the acts of royal consolidation, again, whose perspectives are we hearing in 2 Samuel? And I'm not going to try to parse these out, as a couple of the authors that I've spent a lot of time in preparing this sequence here, scholars like Lyle Esslinger and Jan Falkelman, reading it narratively and putting aside the question of sources, but that has its own problem, because I've been noting throughout, recently in the Genesis series on the Laban story, of the parallels between Genesis and 2 Samuel here in the David story. And one of the questions that we really do need to answer, at least for ourselves, if not as a historical fact, is which came first? In other words, is the authors of Samuel have Genesis and they're writing up against that? Or is Genesis, as I've been arguing throughout all these series, a later exilic and post-exilic text that's reflecting an alternative for the exilic and post-exilic audiences to restoring the Davidic monarchy after the Persians defeat the Babylonians and invite the former exiles to return and rebuild Jerusalem and its temple under Persian sponsorship. So I'm not going to try to sort out which verses or which passages from which. As we'll see in 2 Samuel 7, there's a plainly Deuteronomistic element there that suggests that it's later than some of the earlier passages, maybe not part of what I've been arguing is the overall attempt to legitimize David and Solomon's reign in this whole unit all the way up to 1 Kings. But as we'll see, there's also an undercurrent. So we'll be looking at those along the way, and just to go briefly over these 6 possibilities. That David himself, as quoted by contemporaries, so the words from David are actually David's words, and a number of scholars treat it that way, is that there's a historical core there and David's being quoted. Alternatively, a pro-Davidic author who's in support of a Jerusalem monarchy as a permanent institution, which we certainly see in the after Solomon elements of 1st and 2nd Kings, when the so-called sin of Jeroboam and daring to lead people to worship someplace outside of Jerusalem is repeated constantly about the problem with Israel as a separate entity, that they don't worship in Jerusalem. So we'll see much of that. A pro-Davidic author with mixed feelings about monarchy as a larger project, and we've seen some of that along the way, and we'll see more of that as we go. An anti-Davidic author with mixed feelings about monarchy as a larger project, and we'll see some of that in the implications that perhaps David is cynical, or perhaps David is self-absorbed or narcissistic, or has something other than the good of Yahweh or the will of Yahweh and the good of Israel and Judah in his mind. Or an anti-Davidic author who's also anti-monarchy, who's trying to show in some of the story the problems of monarchy and the problems of what happens when you equate a human being with having God's authority, or a combination of the above. And the likelihood is that there is a combination, that this large story was composed, as I've been suggesting, originally at the time of the David-Solomon reign, but has certainly been edited and added to over the course of centuries. And we certainly know that the Deuteronomistic history itself, which ends in 2 Kings, doesn't end until at least the time of the last story, which is the last king before exile. So there's plenty of evidence for that, but I'm not going to worry us over all the details of that as we go. So let's just go briefly over some of the elements of what the story shows us of David's consolidation. I would like to highlight that some of these things are unique to the Bible, like the story of the Ark, but many of these are stereotypical ways in which kings in the ancient world claimed that they had power to the public in their own people and to the foreigners who might want to be allies or might want to be enemies. So the first thing is David needs a city. And we'll see that in 5:6-10. David will take Jerusalem from the Jebusites. I really want to underscore the violence of that. It's not that it's a gift from God. It's not started over from scratch like he built it. It's stolen, and the text makes it quite plain that it's stolen. And if we want to see how scandalous some of these things were, we can read 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, which I'm not going to do for this series, and see exactly which scenes the later authors found too controversial and omitted in the telling the story of David. And their goal was to support the fact that the temple is the goal of creation, that they start not just with Samuel's birth back in 1 Samuel, but with the creation story in Genesis 1 and lead right up to Solomon's building of the temple. So they're not concerned with the monarchy, they're concerned with the priestly perspective on the temple, and they leave out all the elements that would be controversial, including stealing Jerusalem from the Jebusites. Next, he will develop a powerful supporter in King Hiram of Tyre to build David's palace, exactly the kind of alliance that we see kings do all over the Middle East and all over the world to establish alliances and networks. He will display, the text will show a display of masculine power and fertility, with him taking more unnamed women and a whole litany of children. And that was certainly a stereotypical way, and the king showed authority. But notice what this story will not do that empires connected with polytheism could do, which is a so-called hieros gamos, a Greek term for so-called sacred marriage, which is a ritual by which a woman who is selected in advance and worked for the king had ritual intercourse with the king to express the divine approval of not only the king's authority, but of the fertility of the land on behalf of the people. And with the monotheism that they illustrate, although monotheism ultimately was not really clear amongst the biblical writers until after exile, but certainly we could call it the henotheism, the belief that we only worship one God even if there are many gods. Yahweh, also named as Elohim, and we'll see in chapter 7, given a variety of attributes, but that one God as male and female, as Genesis puts it. We don't know if the authors of Samuel perceive of their God Yahweh as male and female, as Genesis does, or simply following the male pronouns that the language uses as a sky father. But in any event, it's only one, so they can't have this ritual by which the earth mother and the sky father have intercourse to provide fertility. And so what we see instead is David's own literal fertility with his having more children. And we'll see curiously with Solomon, with his 700 wives and 300 concubines, we only hear of one child, Rehoboam himself. So we'll see after that a display of divine reliance for victory, that David consults Yahweh and twice defeats the Philistines, and as we'll see in contrast with Saul consulting Yahweh and Yahweh not answering him back in 1 Samuel 14. And so we'll see the formulaic version of that David asks Yahweh what to do, Yahweh tells him what to do, and it happens. Then we get into the whole ark story, and I put in quotes here in redemption because it's not a word from the text, but a redemption of a past national shame, the recovery of the ark and installing it in Jerusalem with celebration. But that ends with losing the allegiance of Saul's daughter Michal. And perhaps that's part of the overall story that we'll see farther down of his controlling the house of Saul. And what would, after all, a child of David and Michal be? Would it be a Davidite or a Saulite? Not clear. So we don't know if that's a historical incident or something that the writers have done to separate David from his Saulite wife. But either way, Michal will have no children via David. Then we see throughout chapter 7, the big chapter, the assertion, surprisingly perhaps, of Yahweh's superior authority to which David acknowledges being subject. David will recognize that he's in a house of cedar and Yahweh's in a tent. And to David, that's embarrassing. But as Yahweh will exclaim, I've never wanted to be confined in a house like you. I'm free of all that. Doesn't quite say he's the creator, but certainly describes a God who's free to move around, as the God who moved around the ark back in 1 Samuel 6 certainly did. And so we'll see how the argument, so implicit argument between David and Yahweh, as David seeks to praise Yahweh endlessly for what Yahweh is doing to David, promising him someone would sit on his throne forever. Although, as we'll see, the Hebrew term ad olam might not literally mean forever. It might simply mean for the foreseeable future or for a long time. We'll get there when we get there. And then continuing on, after having established divine authority for not only his reign, but the reign that follows, and putting aside the building of a temple for one generation, we see David's military victories and what I've described here as a growing and glowing reputation, where the text says he won a name for himself. And he also is described as establishing a circle of royal retainers to carry out his will. We did not hear that with Saul. We only heard about Abner as his military leader, but we did not hear about any other group of retainers who were around him carrying it out. And we'll hear that first for David, and we'll hear much more about that for Solomon in 1 Kings 4 and beyond. Then we'll see what we'd really expect, and this is certainly true in the time of Jesus in the Roman world as much as it is in any time, the taking control of potential rivals, and doing it with a tone that sounds like he's being benevolent rather than eliminating rivals. And so he will take control of the remaining Saulite, Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, and keep him at the royal table and environs to watch him. And so it will sound like beneficence on David's part, that he's caring for his beloved friend Jonathan's son, who's lame, and yet what he's doing is keeping an eye on him and basically keeping him captive. And then our unit will end with David defeating the Ammonites and the Arameans. Note the connection there with the Laban story in Genesis, where Laban near the end is described as an Aramean. And the Genesis story shows not defeat, but a border contract between Jacob and Laban to resolve that dispute. So what I call the religion of empire versus the religion of creation, two different ways of dealing with the Arameans. One of the endless links between the story of the monarchy in Samuel and the book of Genesis, as we'll see. And we stop there because after this, David will be on top of his palace at the time, as the narrator tells us, that the kings go into battle and spies the wife of one of his generals, Uriah, on her roof, and all will come down in the following chapters, including his son Absalom's rebellion. And so this will be the peak of David's rule, and in the Shakespearean narrative of incest and betrayal and murder that follows, we'll see the fall, if not the utter collapse, of the house of David. So hopefully this gives us some perspective on how to start. In next video, we'll see about David taking Jerusalem from the Jebusites. See you for that next time.